I'm Bill, 36 years old, married to Jessie for almost 12 years. We recently moved to a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind where you hear lawnmowers on Saturday mornings and the sound of kids playing in the streets. We have 2 daughters, ages 10 and 12, and like any parents, we were doing our best to settle into this new chapter of our lives. Jessie and I both work, and we'd managed to juggle the demands of our jobs with parenting, making sure our girls were enrolled in the nearby school and slowly turning our new house into a home. The first 6 months went by smoothly. We unpacked most of our boxes, painted the girls' rooms, and even planted a small garden out back. Life was calm, routine, just the way I liked it. I could come home from work and relax in the living room while Jessie made dinner and the kids did their homework. But then came the night our eldest daughter asked for help with her math homework, specifically trigonometry. Jessie and I both stared blankly at the textbook, unable to help. We weren't math people. We'd both studied the humanities. That's when I decided we needed a tutor. One of my colleagues at work recommended Greg, a guy from a neighboring office who had a reputation for being great with kids and math. Greg seemed nice enough when I met him, mid-30s like me, with a quiet and unassuming demeanor. I approached him about tutoring our daughters, and he agreed to meet them once or twice a week after work. Since he didn't have space to host lessons, I invited him to our home. It seemed like the perfect solution. For the first month, things went exactly as planned. Our daughters' math grades improved, and they even seemed to enjoy learning. Greg became a regular presence in our home, blending into the background while I focused on my own routine. He came in after work, Jessie would make them all a snack, and I would retreat to my office or the backyard to unwind after a long day. Everything seemed perfect. Too perfect, in fact. A month went by without a hitch. Greg was punctual, the girls' grades improved, and life seemed as steady as ever. But then, small things began to shift, things that I couldn't quite place at first. It was subtle, the kind of changes you almost don't notice until they pile up. Jessie seemed different. She smiled a little more when Greg was around, laughed a little too hard at his jokes. I brushed it off at first, convincing myself that I was just being paranoid. After all, she was happy our girls were doing well, right? Then came the first late night. One Tuesday, I got stuck at the office finishing up a project. By the time I got home, it was already 9:30 p.m., and the girls were fast asleep. I was expecting to find Jessie relaxing in the living room with a glass of wine, like she usually did after a long day. Instead, I found her sitting in the kitchen with Greg. I paused at the doorway, watching them through the dim light. They were sitting closer than necessary, and the air between them felt charged. Jessie was laughing softly at something Greg said, and when he reached out to touch her arm, I felt my stomach tighten. "Bill, you're home early," Jessie said, startled when she noticed me standing there. She straightened up quickly, as if trying to create space between them. Greg looked surprised too, but he recovered fast, flashing me that easygoing smile. "We were just finishing up here," he said, grabbing his bag. "I'll see you guys on Thursday." He left quickly, with Jessie following him to the door to say goodbye. I stood there, rooted in place, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. It didn't feel right, but I couldn't put my finger on why. When Jessie returned, she acted like nothing was out of the ordinary. She kissed me on the cheek and asked if I was hungry, offering to heat up the leftovers she'd made for dinner. I tried to let it go, but something was off. The warmth in her kiss felt mechanical. That night, as I lay in bed beside her, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the way they'd been sitting together, how comfortable they seemed in each other's presence. Maybe I was overreacting, I thought. Jessie had never given me a reason to doubt her before. But deep down, a seed of suspicion had been planted, and no matter how much I tried to shake it, it grew. The next few weeks were a haze of anxiety. I watched Jessie and Greg more closely whenever they were together, searching for signs, hints of something more. It drove me crazy, this quiet suspicion gnawing at the edges of my mind. But there was no hard evidence, nothing to confront Jessie with. So, I stayed silent, hoping that I was wrong, praying that it was all in my head. Until the day I came home early. It was a Friday afternoon when everything changed. A power outage at work sent us all home early, and instead of calling Jessie to let her know, I thought I'd surprise her and the girls. As I pulled into our street, I noticed Greg's car parked a few houses down. Confused, I checked the time. It was only 2:30 p.m. The girls wouldn't be home from school for at least another hour. There wasn't supposed to be a tutoring session today. A pit formed in my stomach. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe Greg was visiting another neighbor, or had come by to drop something off. But as I walked up to the front door, I realized how wrong that felt. The house was too quiet, too still. I pushed the door open, and the silence that greeted me was unsettling. Usually, I'd hear Jesse's voice or the distant hum of the television, but there was nothing. The air felt thick, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I moved through the hallway, noticing that the living room was empty, but there was something in the air, a faint smell of cologne. Greg's cologne. My pulse quickened as I made my way toward the kitchen, and that's when I heard its soft voices, followed by a faint laugh. It was Jesse's laugh, but different. It was a sound I hadn't heard in a long time, the kind of carefree laughter she used to have when we first started dating. My heart pounded in my chest, a mix of fear and anger coursing through me. I rounded the corner and froze. There, in the kitchen, our kitchen, Jesse and Greg were wrapped around each other. Her back was pressed against the counter, and his hands were resting on her hips, holding her close. They hadn't seen me yet, too wrapped up in whatever whispered conversation they were having. But the intimacy between them, the way they touched and looked at each other, said everything I needed to know. For a split second, the world went silent. Time stopped. The betrayal hit me like a punch to the gut, but the rage quickly followed. What the hell is this? My voice shattered the moment. They both jumped, startled, and Jessie pushed Greg away, her face going pale. Bill, this isn't what it looks like, she stammered, trying to cover herself, as if the words could somehow undo the damage. But it was exactly what it looked like. Greg, on the other hand, had gone pale, his eyes wide with fear. He didn't say anything, probably because he knew there was nothing he could say that would save him now. I lunged toward him, grabbing him by the collar of his shirt, and slammed him into the wall. "Get out of my house!" I roared, my voice shaking with fury. I didn't wait for an answer. I hit him a hard punch that sent him stumbling toward the door. Jessie screamed, trying to pull me back, but I shook her off. I wasn't listening to her anymore. My focus was on Greg as I pushed him out of the house, slamming the door behind him, leaving him outside, shirtless and humiliated. As the door clicked shut, the weight of everything fell on me all at once. I stood there, my chest heaving, trying to catch my breath, while Jessie frantically tried to explain. "Bill, please, it was a mistake," she pleaded, her voice shaking. "It's not what you think." I turned to face her, my expression cold. "How long?" I asked, my voice flat, emotionless. Her eyes darted around, as if searching for a way out, but there was none. Finally, she looked down at the floor. 2 weeks, she muttered, barely audible. 2 weeks. For 2 weeks, she had been sneaking around with Greg, lying to my face every time she kissed me goodnight. I couldn't believe it. All the little moments that had seemed strange now made perfect, gut-wrenching sense. "Why?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Jessie looked up at me, her eyes full of tears, but there was something cold in her tone. "I felt distant from you, Bill. You've been so consumed with work, with everything else. I needed something." I couldn't even respond. The excuses, the blame, it all felt hollow, like she was trying to shift the fault onto me. I stood there, numb, as she continued to cry, but her tears meant nothing to me anymore. The trust was gone, shattered beyond repair. And so was our marriage. The days that followed were a blur. Jessie tried to apologize, but her words felt like daggers. Each, "I'm sorry," was just another reminder of her betrayal. I couldn't look at her without seeing Greg's hands on her, the laughter they shared in our kitchen. The image of them together was seared into my mind. Sleep was nearly impossible, and when I did manage to drift off, I'd wake up in a cold sweat, still hearing her voice, still seeing them. I moved into the guest room. We didn't tell the kids anything. They were too young to understand the storm brewing between us, and I wasn't ready to tear their world apart just yet. Jessie and I communicated only when necessary, always with forced politeness when the girls were around. but the tension between us was suffocating. It was clear that our marriage was over. The only question left was how to end it. That's when the idea of revenge started to take root. At first, it was just a passing thought, something I entertained in the middle of sleepless nights when anger gnawed at me. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Greg and Jesse had torn my life apart in the most humiliating way possible, right under my own roof. Why should I quietly slink away while they got off easy? No, I deserved to take back some control, to make them pay for what they did. But I knew I had to be smart about it. Greg was already humiliated when I threw him out half naked, but that wasn't enough. Jesse needed to feel the sting too, and it couldn't just be some reckless outburst. No, this had to be slow, thoughtful, painful. I started with research. Late at night, when Jesse thought I was asleep, I'd scroll through her social media. I kept it subtle at first, just trying to gather information: Greg's posts, his likes, comments from mutual friends. It didn't take long to piece together a clearer picture of who he was outside of tutoring my daughters. He was just as unassuming online as he was in person, which made me wonder how many others had fallen for the same act. Then I found something interesting. Greg had a side business, something he hadn't mentioned when I first met him. He was quietly building up a tutoring agency on the side, advertising himself as the perfect solution for struggling students, promising personal attention and results. I knew the business was small, but with a few well-placed reviews or a whisper in the right circles, I could destroy it before it ever took off. But I needed more. Greg wasn't the only one who had to suffer. Jessie, too, had her own vulnerabilities. She prided herself on being the perfect suburban mom, always involved with school activities, planning the next neighborhood block party, and making sure the other moms thought she had it all together. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that her image was everything to her. That was her Achilles heel, her need to be seen as flawless, admired. I started thinking of ways I could ruin that. Public humiliation would have its day, but first, I had to dismantle her carefully curated life piece by piece. Jessie was oblivious to the fact that I was watching her so closely, studying every move, waiting for the perfect time to strike. Step by step, the plan began to take shape. I'd make sure Greg and Jessie would feel just as powerless and humiliated as they had made me feel. And the beauty of it all? They'd never see it coming. But I had to play my part first. Pretend to be the wounded husband who was willing to let things slide for the sake of the family. I needed them to feel safe, to think I had accepted what happened and was ready to move on. So, I started acting. I began attending the school events with Jessie again, making sure to hold her hand in front of the other parents, flashing that fake smile to keep up appearances. Behind closed doors, we were still miles apart, but in public, I played my role perfectly. And Greg? I kept my distance from him, which wasn't hard since he never showed his face around our house again. But I made sure I was seen talking to him at work functions or around town, just enough to give the impression that I was handling things like a mature adult. The truth was, I was laying the groundwork for the fall that was coming. I wanted them both to think they had gotten away with it, to let their guard down completely. Because when my revenge hit, it would be swift. And it would be devastating. The more I planned, the more calm I felt. My anger no longer burned, it had cooled into something sharper, more focused. Jessie and Greg were going to pay, and I was going to enjoy every second of it. The first step in my plan involved Greg's little tutoring business. It didn't take long to find a few parents who weren't as thrilled with his services as we had been. A couple of them had mentioned minor complaints, nothing serious, just a dissatisfaction with how slow their children were progressing. I reached out to them anonymously, under the guise of a concerned parent, planting seeds of doubt. "It's so strange," I'd write. "I heard some things about Greg from another parent, nothing concrete, but they said his attention was elsewhere during tutoring sessions. Just thought you'd want to know." That was all it took. A few whispers and rumors started to spread through the neighborhood and among the parents at school. Within days, the complaints started popping up in online reviews. Not enough to ruin him just yet, but enough to chip away at his credibility. Next, I set my sights on Jessie. Jessie had always been one of the neighborhood's go-to moms for organizing events, especially anything to do with the kids. The fall carnival was coming up at the school, and she was, of course, in charge of coordinating it. Perfect. I started poking around her emails, her her Facebook messages, her private chats. She'd long since stopped bothering with security, and I had full access to everything. It didn't take much effort to subtly sabotage her. A few accidental deletions of important emails, a reschedule here, a misplaced order there. By the time the carnival rolled around, things were already a disaster. Half the volunteers didn't show up because they never received confirmations. The decorations were all wrong because the supplier sent the wrong items, Jessie's own mistake, though she'd never realize it was me who canceled her original order. And of course, the kids didn't have enough games to play because the equipment arrived late, thanks to a delivery I had conveniently delayed. I watched from the sidelines, smiling to myself as Jessie scrambled to salvage the mess. The other moms, always so quick to praise her, now threw sideways glances and muttered about how disorganized the whole thing had been. Jessie's perfect reputation was starting to fray, and she didn't even know why. The beauty of it all? She still had no idea that I was behind any of it. We were still playing our parts at home, me as the supportive husband, her as the stressed but determined wife, trying to hold everything together. But behind her back, I was dismantling her life one piece at a time. The next phase required a bit more precision. Jessie loved her social media presence. Every weekend, she'd post pictures of us as a happy family, me, her, and the girls at various events, smiling and pretending everything was perfect. It was all about appearances for her. So, I decided to use that to my advantage. I started dropping hints to a few close friends of ours, always in passing, about how Jessie seemed distant lately. I never accused her of anything directly, but I made sure to mention how tired she seemed, how she had been spending more time away than usual. It was enough to get them talking, enough to start a ripple of doubt in our social circle. One night, while Jessie was asleep, I took it a step further. I logged into her Facebook account and posted a message in a private moms group, something vague but suggestive. Hey ladies, I've been having a tough time lately, feeling disconnected from my husband and life in general. Any advice on how to feel like yourself again? It was a simple post, nothing too revealing, but enough to raise eyebrows. Within minutes, the responses flooded in concerned moms offering advice, asking if everything was okay, wanting to help. But more importantly, they began speculating, whispering amongst themselves, wondering if Jessie's marriage was falling apart. And all the while, Jessie had no clue. The final piece of the puzzle involved Greg. I needed something more than rumors to really take him down. I needed proof of his incompetence, something that would make it impossible for parents to trust him again. I thought about confronting him, trying to get him to admit to the affair or his neglect in tutoring, but I knew that would be too risky. Instead, I decided to let someone else do the dirty work for me. One of the other parents I had been in contact with had a child who was struggling in math, and she'd hired Greg at my suggestion. What she didn't know was that I had already started planting doubts in her mind about his reliability. When her son's grades didn't improve as quickly as expected, I pushed her a little further. I suggested that Greg's focus might be split between his tutoring and other distractions. It didn't take long before she requested a meeting with the school to discuss Greg's role as a tutor. And when she did, I made sure the right people were listening. Within a week, Greg's reputation was in tatters. Parents started pulling their kids from his sessions, and soon after, his tutoring agency began to crumble. One by one, everything was falling into place. Jessie's social circle was growing suspicious, her reputation was being slowly dismantled, and Greg's professional life was collapsing. And neither of them had any idea that I was the one pulling the strings. I had to admit, watching Jessie and Greg's lives unravel was more satisfying than I'd expected. The beauty was in the subtlety, the slow burn, the chaos building just beneath the surface while they carried on, oblivious to the storm I was stirring up. But I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The final phase of my plan was going to be explosive, and it required impeccable timing. Everything I'd done so far had been quiet, almost invisible. Now, it was time to make some noise. Jessie had a big event coming up, a charity gala she'd helped organize. It was one of those fancy, dress-up affairs that the local elites loved to attend. Jessie had poured herself into this event for months, even more so after the carnival fiasco, desperate to prove that she still had her act together. This was her chance to reclaim her standing among the other parents, and she'd been stressing over every detail, making sure it went off without a hitch. But what she didn't know was that I had something very special planned for that night. I had been waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth about Jesse and Greg. As much as I enjoyed watching their lives crumble bit by bit, I wanted a grand finale, a moment that would leave no doubt about their betrayal. I knew Jessie cared deeply about how she was perceived by the other moms, but I wanted her to experience the sting of public humiliation. And there was no better place to do that than at the gala, in front of all her friends, colleagues, and neighbors. The day of the gala arrived, and Jessie was a bundle of nerves. She'd spent hours getting ready, making sure every detail was perfect, from her hair to her dress to the decorations at the venue. She was trying to make up for the disaster at the school carnival, and I could see how desperate she was to make this event flawless. I played my part well that day, complimenting her on how beautiful she looked, offering to help with last-minute tasks, and even driving us to the venue together. She had no idea that I was about to turn her world upside down. Once we arrived, I mingled with the other guests, playing the charming husband. The atmosphere was light, filled with laughter and champagne glasses clinking. Jessie flitted from group to group, smiling and making small talk, clearly enjoying the attention and the chance to redeem herself. She was in her element again, and I let her bask in it for a while. But as the evening went on, I slipped away unnoticed. I had a few more pieces to set in motion before the night's big reveal. The first was simple. I had compiled screenshots of Jessie and Greg's private messages, texts, social media DMs, all the incriminating evidence I'd quietly collected over the past few months. Nothing too graphic, but enough to prove that their affair had been going on longer than either of them had admitted. I had them printed and placed in a plain envelope. The contents of that envelope were about to go public. Next, I made sure Greg was at the gala. He hadn't been on the guest list, but I had anonymously sent him an invite, making it sound like Jessie had extended the invitation. I knew his ego wouldn't let him refuse the opportunity to see her in person. Sure enough, he showed up about an hour into the event, lingering on the outskirts of the crowd, trying to be discreet but clearly scanning the room for Jessie. Perfect. As the speeches began, Jessie took her place at the podium, smiling brightly as she addressed the crowd. She was poised, confident, and for a brief moment, I almost felt bad about what was about to happen. Almost. As she spoke, I slipped over to the event's tech crew, where I had already arranged a little surprise. I handed them the envelope and quietly instructed them to display its contents on the projector behind the stage right as Jessie finished her speech. They hesitated for a moment, but after slipping them a generous tip, they nodded and set everything up. I returned to the crowd, blending in as Jessie continued her speech. She was wrapping up, thanking everyone for their support, clearly basking in the applause. I caught Greg's eye across the room. He was watching her with that familiar look of admiration, completely unaware of the trap I had set. Then, as the applause died down and Jessie stepped back from the podium, the projector flickered to life. At first, the crowd didn't notice, too busy chatting and clapping. But slowly, murmurs started to ripple through the room. The screen behind Jessie was now displaying a series of screenshots, the text between her and Greg, the flirtatious messages, the admissions of guilt. Jessie froze. At first, she didn't understand what was happening, but as she turned around and saw the images behind her, her face went white. A collective gasp swept through the crowd, and the room fell into stunned silence. I could hear whispers spreading like wildfire. Is that Jessie? Oh my God. Look at what she's saying. That's Greg, the tutor, right? Jessie's hands flew to her mouth as she stared at the screen, horror dawning in her eyes. She looked around frantically, her perfect evening unraveling in front of everyone she cared about. Greg, too, had gone pale, and I watched as he tried to slink toward the exit, but the damage was done. Everyone had seen the messages. They all knew. I stepped forward then, making sure to catch Jessie's eye. She looked at me, her face a mixture of shock, betrayal, and desperation. I didn't say anything I didn't need to. The satisfaction of watching her world implode in front of everyone was enough. Without a word, I turned and walked out of the venue, leaving Jessie and Greg to deal with the aftermath. The whispers, the judgmental stares, the utter humiliation. It was exactly what they deserved. The best part? My hands were clean. I hadn't yelled. I hadn't caused a scene. I had simply let the truth come to light in the most public way possible. And as I drove away from the gala, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Peace. In the days following the gala, the fallout was swift and brutal. I stayed quiet, letting the chaos unfold on its own. I didn't need to do anything more. Jesse's reputation had been thoroughly destroyed, and Greg's career was in shambles. The whispers and gossip spread like wildfire, especially among the school moms and community members who had always held Jesse in such high regard. The morning after the gala, I packed a bag and left the house. I didn't say much to Jessie. There wasn't anything left to say. She had tried calling me several times, but I ignored every call. By the time I returned later that afternoon, she was gone. She had taken her things and left without a word, probably seeking refuge at her parents' place. It was over. I filed for divorce the next week, and Jessie didn't contest it. I think she was too ashamed, too broken by what had happened to even try to fight it. We agreed on shared custody of the girls, though they would primarily live with me. Jessie would still be involved in their lives, but it was clear that she'd never be able to repair the damage she'd done to our family. The girls didn't know the full story. Of course, they only knew that their mom and dad weren't together anymore. But even they seemed to sense that something had shifted, that their mother wasn't quite the same. As for Greg, his tutoring business collapsed almost overnight. Word had spread quickly about his affair with Jessie, and no parent in the neighborhood wanted anything to do with him. He lost clients one by one, and soon enough, his small side business was nothing more than a bad memory. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he moved away a few months later, trying to start fresh in a new town where no one knew his name. Good riddance. But what surprised me most in the aftermath of it all was the quiet satisfaction I felt not just in seeing Jessie and Greg fall, but in my own newfound freedom. The bitterness and anger that had consumed me for so long began to fade, replaced by a sense of calm. I had taken back control of my life in a way that felt deeply satisfying. There was no need for further revenge, no lingering need to hurt them any more than I already had. I focused on rebuilding my life, this time on my own terms. I poured myself into my work, into being the best father I could be for my daughters. They were my world now, and I made sure they felt as little of the impact from the divorce as possible. We found a new rhythm, just the three of us, and in time, the hurt began to heal. The neighborhood eventually moved on, as people do. Jessie became a distant memory in social circles, her once perfect image forever tarnished by what had happened. She stayed around for the girls' sake, but she was never the same. I could see it in her eyes during the handoffs, the way she avoided eye contact, the way she seemed smaller, more fragile. I never gloated or threw her mistakes back in her face. I didn't need to. She was already paying the price every day, living with the weight of her choices. One evening, months after everything had blown over, Jessie and I sat together at a school event for the girls. It was awkward at first. There was still so much unspoken between us, but for the first time, I noticed how tired she looked, worn down, not just by life, but by the guilt and shame she carried with her. I almost felt sorry for her. "Bill," she started, her voice small. "I'm so sorry for everything. I know I ruined everything." I didn't respond right away. There was no anger left in me, no need to lash out or make her feel worse than she already did. I just nodded, staring ahead at the kids playing in the distance. "I know," I said quietly, "but it's done now. We're different people because of it. We have to move forward." She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes, but she didn't say anything more. There was nothing more to say. She had made her choices, and I had made mine. The only thing left was to focus on the future. As I drove home that night, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't realized I was missing. The revenge had been sweet, no doubt about it. Watching their lives crumble had given me the satisfaction I needed in the moment. But the real victory wasn't in their downfall. It was in my own ability to rise above it all, to rebuild my life stronger than it had been before. I had been wronged, yes, betrayed in the worst possible way, but I hadn't let it break me. I'd turned that pain into something more, something that allowed me to take control of my life again. Jessie and Greg? They were just players in a game I had already won, and now it was time to move on. Discover more stories. Subscribe today.